I'm sure almost everyone has heard of the plague at some point in their life, whether it was a history class or maybe a movie they watched. But does anyone really know what happened to all those innocent souls during the dark times? The plague, also known as the Great Mortality or the Black Death, was a bubonic plague pandemic that occurred in Western Eurasia and North Africa from 1346 to 1352. Ultimately, it resulted in the death of 75 to 200 million individuals. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread by fleas, it's also spread by person-to-person contact. It's believed the Black Death originated from the Tian Shan Mountains, which are located on the border of Kazakhstan and China around 2,600 years ago. The exact origin of the plague remains unknown, but most evidence points to the origin site being in Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Europe. It's believed the pandemic first spread to Europe during the siege of Genesee, trading port of Kaffa by Jenny Bean in 1347. Carried by fleas and rats in the ship, which brought this horrific disease to the Mediterranean basin and reaching North Africa, Western Asia, and the rest of Europe. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered on the docks were met with a horrifying surprise. Most of the sailors that were aboard these ships were dead, and those alive were still gravely ill. Here's a picture of the rats and the fleas which transported the disease to the humans. And then this is kind of a map of where the plague spread to. And then this is where they think it originated, which is on the border of China and Kazakhstan. Okay, so this type of contact, person to person, is much faster than the spread through rats and fleas. Ingesting contaminated animals and physical contact with infected victims or direct inhalation of infectious respiratory droplets also cause this infection. So some of the symptoms of the plague included painful bumps in the groin, neck, and armpits, and these bumps could actually secrete pus and blood. Another one is an acute fever, vomiting blood, and parts of the body turning colors like black. So here's a picture, and this person's toes have turned completely black, and then here's one of those bumps that would secrete pus and blood. People would also have really swollen lymph nodes, and they would get really big until they couldn't move their neck. So after contracting this sickness, the victims had between 2 and 7 days to live. The death rate was between 60 and 90%. One of the most recognizable factors of the Black Death was the plague doctors the government set out. These so-called doctors wore protective clothing with a long cape, mask, and a bill-like portion over the mouth and nose containing aromatic substances, which would block out the putrid smell of decaying corpses. Perhaps an earlier version of the hazmat suit, which we know. Here's a picture of the plague doctor. So they also used wooden canes to point out areas needing attention and to examine patients without having to touch them. The canes were also used to keep people away and to remove clothing from plague victims without having to touch them. These doctors would go around to the homes of the infected and isolate the infected and their families within their homes. People of that period thought warm baths permitted the plague miasma to enter humans' pores, so all the public baths were closed. Victims' clothes and possessions were contaminated and burned, and cats were killed as possible transmission agents. So basically, once you got the plague, you just had to say goodbye to your family, and the doctors would come, and you'd be locked in there until all of you died. So up until the 1900s, they still isolated parts of the hospitals just for victims of the plague because it was so contagious. During the Black Death, European Christians blamed their Jewish neighbors for the plague, claiming Jews were poisoning the wells. These beliefs led to massacres and violence. At least 235 Jewish communities experienced mass persecution and destruction during this period. While the first wave of Black Death was in the 1300s, this was not the only one. The pandemics continued to strike Europe in the late 1500s and between 1600 and 1670. It wasn't until the 1800s that they finally investigated the plague. A team of scientists from Europe sent the disease information to French-Swiss bacteriologist André Yersin. He then named the disease after himself, Yersinia pestis. When the plague broke out in Bombay, in colonial India in 1893, in the Nauroji Hill district, a grown doctor called Akasho Viegas was the first to identify the disease as bubonic plague. he made efforts to kill rats, which convinced authorities to call in experts like Waldemar Haffkine. That's Waldemar. Haffkine worked on the vaccine for the plague. In 1896, he produced a vaccine that needed human testers. He used it on himself and prison volunteers. This vaccine produced a few side effects and only reduced the chance of getting the plague by 50%. As for today's time, there have been a few cases in Central Asia of the plague, but that's about it. With current antibiotics, the mortality rate has decreased from 60% to 11%. Nowadays, scientists can identify the exact strains they come from and their origins, making it easier to track the spread. The plague can be treated and cured with antibiotics. If you're diagnosed, you'll be hospitalized and given these treatments. In some cases, you may be put in an isolation unit. Antibiotics that can treat it include ciprofloxacin, miofloxacin, gentamicin, and doxycycline. The Black Death was the second greatest horrific disaster to hit Europe during the later Middle Ages. It's estimated to kill 30% to 60% of the European population. And 33% of the population of the Middle East, and outbreaks of this plague recurred around the world until the early 19th century. This disease took the lives of many innocent and unsuspecting individuals from the 1300s all the way to the 1900s. It is important to remember how lucky we are to know that the symptoms and cures for these life-threatening diseases.